Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 3. We are so happy to have you here. We have some unstable internet, so our moderator will hopefully be back with us shortly. But to kick us off, we just want to say welcome for everyone, and thank you so much for those of you who are joining our 3rd session, and we are so happy to have you here if this is your first session. I'm going to send it over to my colleague Samantha to explain, excuse me, to explain our translator channels.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everybody. Oh, and Yudnik, I see you've rejoined us. Welcome back. So thank you for joining today. Before we get started, I'm just going to do some logistics for the webinar. So first, in addition to today's discussion, you should see a Q&A, or rather a chat box where you could submit questions or ask for any clarifications. If you do experience any technical difficulties, please just use that chat box. So you can chat the attendees or the meeting hosts to try and sort those out. Now, a really important part of today's webinar is that you are going to have to select a language. So our webinar will be in English, one of our panelists will be speaking in French, and there will be simultaneous interpretation into French. So before we start, those who want to listen to the webinar in French should select a language option. Same with those who need to listen to the English translation. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a globe icon that says interpretation, and please select either English or French. You can also mute the original audio so that if you are listening to one of those languages, you can mute the original narration. And if you're on a mobile device in your meeting controls, you'll tap the 3 dots and then tap language interpretation, and there should be the same option to mute original audio. And I'm just going to go over these instructions in French really briefly so our francophone colleagues know how to get to that option as well. Alors, le webinaire, c'est en anglais, mais il y aura une interprétation en français. Avant de commencer le webinaire, chacun doit choisir une option linguistique. Regardez en bas de votre écran Zoom et trouvez l'icône du globe qui indique interprétation. Sélectionnez le français. Vous pouvez couper le son original si vous ne voulez pas entendre la narration en anglais. Si vous êtes sur un appareil mobile, appuyez sur les 3 points. Ensuite, appuyez sur l'interprétation linguistique. Si vous avez des questions à ce sujet, n'hésitez pas à les poser dans la boîte de discussion. And finally, this webinar is being recorded in French and English. Thank you again for joining and for your participation.
So we're just going to briefly chat about why we're doing this webinar and why you're here. This webinar was organized by IAWG, the Interagency Working Group for Reproductive Health in Crisis, and FP2020. And the reason why we organized this webinar series is because we were hearing from young people and youth organizations that COVID was particularly hitting hard your organizations and you needed some operational support. So we developed a 3-part series, and then we shared it with young people and youth organizations to get feedback. And then we co-developed this Q&A guide with our moderators, our youth focal points from FP2020. So we really are trying to be responsive to your needs, and we're so excited to share all these different perspectives from our speakers today. And our session today is focused on getting ahead. And so we'll be talking about resource mobilization, talking about advocacy, and a number of other topics. And to briefly back up, IAWG, the Interagency Working Group for Reproductive Health in Crisis, this is a broad-based, highly collaborative coalition of more than 20 steering committee members. And this organization represents UN, government, NGOs, donors, with over 2,100 individual members from nearly 500 agencies. So we are just so excited to have all of our speakers today. I'm going to kick it over to Yudnik to get us started.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really sorry previously that we had a blackout, which happens more frequently in our country. So I'll just try to briefly give you like what does it look like from as a physician from the clinical side, as well as a youth which is experiencing or leading youth-led organization, and the obstacles or the challenges that we are facing during these pandemics, especially the pre-planned activities that we were planned to do during these pandemics, as well as the preparedness. So one of the things is that of at the beginning of the pandemics, most of the resource and everything preparedness was made to the mitigation of the COVID-19 transmission in order to decrease its transmission, as well as like in order to stop it from spreading to the entire country or from or increasing number, which had a negative impact in the essential healthcare services. For example, sexual and reproductive health and rights. For instance, like family planning services, especially youth-friendly family planning services, in which there was a very good atmosphere for us as politically, as well as in our International Youth Alliance on Family Planning, Ethiopia. We were trying to advocate and create these youth-friendly family planning services, but these pandemics have caused that a decrease both in family planning services entirely, as well as other essential healthcare services. For example, for different adolescents and young adults, as well as youth, there were a compromise of accessing these, for example, STI services, basic delivery services, the antenatal care for young mothers, and others. So during the first couple of months, the mortality rates due to these causes, for example, young maternal mortality, unsafe abortion, unwanted pregnancy, have relatively increased in comparison to the days or the complication due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So one of the good things that we advocated or worked was to also focus or advocate for essential care services, as well as to advocate for youth rights. And especially in our organization, since there was a state of emergency, we could not gather together, and the internet connection is kind of expensive in our country, as well as it's not stable. So most of the works that we were doing in person and advocating in different areas were compromised. So one of our challenges were like the budget challenge, as well as the different commitment areas were not strengthened. And since most of the agendas have shifted from this into the COVID pandemics, like most of the available fundings and other workings were more into, related to COVID-19. So even if we want to sustain those activities or works that we have been doing in reproductive health with special emphasis on youth-friendly family planning services, it has to be somehow related to COVID-19 in order to continue that work. So it was kind of the challenging, and the other where we were not that much prepared about the gender-based violence, in which it has been increasing drastically because the perpetrators are in the same household as the victims. So we haven't thought that much about it, especially the child marriage and rape in some rural areas have been a big headache, even sometimes even greater than that of the COVID-19. So maybe in the future that we should give emphasis for these essential healthcare services, as well as we should not only focus or restrict our resources only for COVID-19. So this is one of the best take-home messages that we are doing. And also we are, as a physician, I'm working as a COVID-19 frontliner, but at the same time, on other time, I'm advocating for essential healthcare services, as well as sexual reproductive rights of youth as well as adolescents. Thank you. So now I'm going to introduce you the speakers that we are going to have for the next couple of minutes. Just give me a moment. We have 4 panelists for today. I'm going to call their name, and they're going to give you a brief introduction or a brief about what they are doing and why they are here, and especially for youth and for those who are working on the community-based working areas. They are going to give us a very good experience, as well as how to find these budgets, as well as mitigation for the future. So our first speakers are Alicia, Merit, Valentina, as well as Miriam. So I will directly take you to Alicia.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Alicia Adler. I am a health policy and communications specialist at the International Rescue Committee. So I support with policy and advocacy work to advance our reproductive health programs.
Okay, thank you very much for the brief introduction. And our second panelist is Merit from IPPF.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm Meredith Liebrick from IPPF WHR. I'm the director of our Innovation and Social Enterprise Lab. And for those of you who aren't familiar with IPPF WHR, we work with an ecosystem of feminist activists and a network of autonomous nonprofit partner organizations. Miriam from Hagen is one of the partners within our network. And we all work together to ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, and advocate for sexual and reproductive health and rights as well. Several of our partners are community-based or have community-based and youth-led models. So very excited to share today.
Thank you very much, Merit. And our third panelist is Valentina from Miriza. Valentina Miriza from CARE. Sorry for mispronouncing your name.
Not at all. So my name is Valentina Mirza. I'm the Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for Asia Pacific based in Bangkok, and I work with CARE. CARE is a gender-focused organization. In our region, we're present in about 21 countries. And as part of our gender mandate, SRHR is a core part of how we do things. And we also have a strong investment in localization and supporting our partners on the ground. Very happy to be with you today.
Thank you very much. And our fourth panelist is Miriam from Haiti Adolescent Girls Network and serving as an executive director.
Bonjour à tous, je suis Myriam Narcisse, je suis la directrice exécutive de Haiti Adolescent Girls Network, très couramment appelée Hagen. On est une organisation de la communautaire de base et qui regroupe également aussi d'autres organisations communautaires de base dans différentes communautés. Donc, notre travail vraiment se concentre sur l'autonomisation des adolescentes et des jeunes filles, jeunes femmes, avec un fort accent sur la santé sexuelle reproductive et la prévention de la violence. Donc, j'ai l'habitude de participer aux différents webinaires organisés
reproductive health and sexual health, and we are a group of community-based organizations throughout Haiti, and we work to support their work. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all our panelists for today. And we have learned a lot about this pandemic, and throughout the course of a couple of months, we have seen that not only the virus or the COVID-19 pandemic is not only essential, but also the other correlated challenges are also as important as we can see. And let's hear from the speakers about what they have learned and what you would do differently from your different points of view. So first, let's hear from Valentina.
I think the reality of COVID was that it forced us beyond anything anyone could prepare for, really. So in my role, I work with the country teams and our partners in the 20 countries that we work in to support them on preparedness and response. And if before COVID, maybe our worst response was an earthquake or a tsunami that was one country bound, with COVID, you're already thrown into a global pandemic where everyone had to respond at the same time. And there's already, although every response in every country has been slightly different, there's been a couple of key reflections that are starting to come out that are important learning for us that we're trying to adapt in future responses. So, you know, all of our countries have to go through an emergency preparedness planning that involves looking at their staffing structure. You know, funding for emergencies and preparedness is relatively limited before the response happens. So you need to think through your teams and who has the right skills that could push forward some of the preparedness efforts. So that's one big piece that every year our countries have to go through. And they need to think through, you know, if we expect an earthquake, what are some of the key sectors we're responding? If it's SRHR, then what are some of the minimum preparedness actions that we need to do? Do we need a framework agreement with suppliers? And obviously, this is all happening in a time when you're not under crisis. When the response actually happens, and I think what COVID brought in very interesting is access can become sometimes a challenge. And for COVID, you know, the management, the remote management aspects was something that took us a little bit off guard because our management model is dependent on what our country teams and our partners can do, but also expecting that you can send in someone from the region or someone global to support wherever there's a gap. So one of the biggest things that will likely change after this is to rethink our surge model, because COVID showed us that there's many times when you're going to be dependent only on what you were able to prepare for and the in-country capacity. So we're going to look at rethinking our surge model, having more local and regional surge support, and thinking more of what that remote support will look like, including, you know, we were already involving our partners in preparedness, but I think it was primarily, we're going to try to have a bit more intentional effort around this. One really interesting example, Philippines was one of our best responders in COVID. And one interesting exercise that we've had was a 2-day remote simulation where we had all our partners doing their normal job that you would do in the office. You're still going to have to do, you know, if you had programs before, you're still going to have to maintain them. So for 2 days, we simulated all the things we had agreed on in terms of assessment and sending proposals out. And that was something that really paid off during COVID. And we're going to try to scale up that in other countries as well. Another big piece that we're trying to invest in is technology. And, you know, when you can't access communities for complaints and feedback mechanisms, we're trying to look at the type of apps that you can use when you don't have internet available. So that's something that we're trying to take from one country and bring to another, where there's been really good practices in this. One really big focus for us has been gender, and we've done rapid gender analysis in 23 countries, and we've had some sub-regional ones. And it, as you know, it has been rightly mentioned, there's things that we're seeing that are specific to services. Services have gone down, but one really big thing was the exclusion of women and girls from decision-making, although we know that women and girls are most affected by crisis. So for us, one big piece that we were very proud of, for example, in Nepal, we were able to bring along into the rapid gender analysis some of the government ministries, our partners. It was an interagency effort. And I think the importance of having tools that everyone knows, having them in the right language so people can use them right away is very important to bring out these needs. And the other piece that we are going to be very strategic about is to make sure that in every country that we work in, we have strategic partnerships with women and youth organizations that can be representative for the voices of the people that we use. We already had partnerships with local organizations, but they weren't always matching the profile of the people that are most affected. So we want to make sure that these voices come along. And the last part that I would want to point is our staff are the people, our biggest asset, and we're always likely to be focused so much on doing things and forget the well-being of our own staff. And if you know, any humanitarian in this room will identify when everyone goes in lockdown, we're the ones that go out. And you know, services in the refugee camps in the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh, they didn't stop. Our female health workers still had to go and provide SRHR and GBV services in the camps, and at the same time be exposed to the risk, carrying the worry of bringing this at home. So I think one area, although we've invested in making sure that they have insurance and that they have the right benefits and the systems to support them, it's an area that you can never do too well. So I think this is one area that we want to think a little bit more through of how do we keep our staff motivated and freed up to do their work. And I mean, I guess there's always learning that you can do about preparedness, but one thing I would encourage you to do is just take a moment to celebrate and be proud of what you've done. It's always so easy afterwards to think of, oh, I could have done that and that. And of course, there's always room for improvement, but just celebrating what you were able to do. You're there on the ground doing it. I can never emphasize enough of how important it is to celebrate what you've done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentina, for the brief description about what you have learned and what you do differently. And next, we'll see what Merit have to do from an innovative perspective. What innovations have you seen that have worked and what has not worked that you will take forward for the next several months to year with COVID-19?
Thanks, Nick. And again, just reflecting that we, within IPPF-WHR, we're working within a network of partners of all different sizes and with different focuses in terms of their operating models, some service delivery, education, advocacy. So when I speak of partners, I'm talking about this mix of partner profiles. But I think what's really interesting with innovation is that in the midst of COVID, the innovations we've seen are really fairly simple, but those that have been most successful have one thing in common, and that's that they have really emerged from listening to the users and the end beneficiaries and looking at how behavior patterns and needs are shifting because of lockdown, because of everything that the COVID context has brought onto our plates and in front of us. And so these shifting behavior patterns, as you can imagine, one of the innovations is that they've given way to this advent of a digital response. And we've seen across that different profiles of partners, we've seen this entire spectrum of how to respond through digital mediums, everything from using WhatsApp to reach clients with counseling for continuity of care, or being very hyper aware that there's an increased incidence of gender-based violence now that women are locked inside with their aggressors. So trying to find ways to still reach women and girls in the midst of this terrible crisis. And then on the other end of the spectrum, building more sophisticated apps for telemedicine and telehealth. But one of the most salient learnings, and I think probably pretty relevant for this group, is that these kind of quote unquote innovations do not have to be complex systems. And those that we've seen be most successful actually just leveraged tools and channels that were already part of people's daily lives. So these are behaviors that they're already used to, mediums they're already used to using. Social media, perfect example. Communicating across barriers and maybe using a channel that had been one directional in the past, but transforming it into a two-directional communication so that it's an intervention where you can continue to offer support through something that is very common within behavior patterns of your users. So I think that it sometimes feels really daunting to think about digital health and these amazing telehealth applications that we see popping up, but some of the most successful innovations have been fairly simple and have really just leveraged these more common mediums, using Facebook, for example, to be able to sell or distribute contraceptives and sexual and reproductive health products and then deliver those to the door on motorcycles. Whereas before COVID, it would have been face-to-face community-based distribution. So it doesn't seem completely groundbreaking, but again, I think that the key here is that the real success factor is being in constant listening mode. And we do this a lot in our social enterprise program and our innovation and incubation program. So it's finding ways to really quickly adapt your interventions using principles of, if you've heard of, design thinking and human-centered design, and sharing a really great field guide, a toolkit from IDEO.org, which is free and open source, and I would recommend in times of COVID and going into the future. How can you design interventions and programs and activities that are built with your users, with your end beneficiaries that are really responding to their needs? So quick, just recapping, using design thinking has been, and listening to users has been a key success factor and has really enabled our partners to be able to harness the power of innovations such as digital health and responses. And kind of understanding this continuous evolution of behavior patterns as a result of COVID, which we're going to see continue to evolve in ways that we can't understand yet. So making these innovations kind of relevant for you and your different contexts.
Okay, thank you very much, Merit, about the brief explanation regarding the innovation perspective. And actually, this innovative perspective is the one which help us to mitigate different services as well as different entities regarding or during these pandemics. And one thing that you have mentioned that is really useful as well as helpful for countries, for instance, such as Ethiopia and other low resource countries in which we cannot implement or adequately disseminate digital health, is that of it can be a local innovative things or solutions. It doesn't have to be only digital or tech based. So for instance, one of the best example or the scenarios that we had is that of the gender-based violence as well as the child marriage has kind of increased during the beginning of the pandemic, and it seems like the schools will not start anytime sooner, and especially people in the rural areas start losing hope in their children and start again the child marriage practice in different regions. So one of the things that we have done in our IYF Ethiopia as well as different networking other organizations that of using that different hashtags, hashtag we will not be quiet, or in our local language, Zimalilim, advocating how much rampant challenge that we're seeing, so that the government should give more commitment as well as to prepare at least some sort of safe shelters for short duration till at least the prosecutors try to ban the perpetrators or give them some sort of punishment. So there was a huge shelter built by some of our colleagues, and those who have been affected with different gender-based violence as well as who have suffered with early marriage have been transported to these safe places, so that at least till that their previous home till it become safe, then they were kind of staying over there. And including space sharing, for instance, in our hospital, then it's one of the biggest hospitals which gives access to safe abortion, and it was kind of terminated for a short while due to, especially at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we kind of try to see that other complications, for instance, rather than coming coming for seeking attention for safe abortion, they would do unsafe abortion in different areas, and then they will come with the purpurar sepsis or other infections, gynecologic infections due to the unsafe abortion complications. Then right after that, we try to see that how much these services are important. So rather than just giving 2 rooms for COVID-19, maybe separating half of the hospital for COVID treatment and the other half for these essential healthcare services, especially for youth and women, become more important. So it's just to say that it doesn't have to be tech or innovative, and just to emphasize that. Thank you very much. And our last panelist is Alicia from an advocacy and communications perspective. And what have you learned? What are the messages have worked and what haven't? And how do you advocate for sexual and reproductive health and rights during the time like this, especially when more emphasis is given for the pandemics and when people or politicians or decision makers think that these things are not relevant as compared to the COVID-19?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. So I think the first thing I would just say is what I've noticed is that people are often allergic to the word advocacy. They're like either scared of it and think it's like lobbying, or it's being really aggressive and shouting what you need. And you also hear, you know, we don't have advocacy staff, so we can't do it. And I think that's such a misperception, because it's actually all of our jobs to do advocacy. We are all advocates because we all care about these issues. And so it's just a matter of really understanding what is advocacy and what role can I play. You know, so for example, a lot of people hear advocacy and it's like, okay, I have to change this massive policy, or I have to create a new policy, and they hear communications and they think, well, that's a big media story. But really it runs this spectrum of, I want to raise raise awareness in my community for the availability of these services. Like that's an aspect of advocacy and communications for reproductive health during COVID. But it's also the big response plans and making sure that SRH is integrated into those. So it's like that huge spectrum of what does it look like. And as you said, I think a lot of policymakers look at reproductive health during a crisis like COVID and say, it's not essential, we'll deal with it later, right? And I can kind of understand how that misperception would happen, because when you have things like food and shelter, I think it would be easy to say, well, you know, contraception, abortion care, we'll figure it out when the crisis ends. But we all working in this area know that, like, just because a crisis happens, people still have sex. People still get pregnant intentionally and unintentionally. People still have unsafe abortions and need services. So we can't wait, right? Like, we have to advocate so that it has to be front and center now, before, during, after the crisis. So that's kind of just, I want to say that because I think there's such a fear of advocacy, and it's just important to set that ground with that background. So how do we advocate for it during COVID? What have I seen? Advocacy looks different depending on what level you're doing it during COVID. A lot of the work I do has been at the global level, making sure that the donors are aware and understanding what's happening, making sure that when we're working with UN agencies or working on global response plans, that there's indicators for reproductive health, that contraception is part of essential services and essential commodities, and just thinking through all of those aspects. But there's 5 quick things, and I promise 5 sounds a lot, but I'll go quick, of lessons that really respond to the question initially. The first lesson that I've seen for COVID advocacy, but also just generally, is the concept that there are power in numbers. Don't advocate alone. So if you're in your community and there's other youth advocates or other organizations, partner with them and see how you can share similar messages and have similar recommendations. It's just louder, it's more effective, it's a great approach that I've seen. The second lesson that I would share is, especially during COVID, is to be really nimble and creative with your advocacy. Get your hands dirty. So maybe don't just have a message, but, like, for example, roll your sleeves up and say, I've noticed that you don't have youth-friendly health services. Here are my recommendations. I'm ready to help you write this policy. I'm ready to help you talk to the media about it, like actually get involved with it. The third is get to know who's involved. I think this is critical during COVID for me as a lesson, is that it's different people. It's not like your typical, just the health cluster that it's involved, not just the typical parliamentarian. It affects everyone. So we all have to, like, really understand who's involved. An interesting example that I saw for this was in Uganda. Because of restrictions, pregnant women weren't able to get to a health facility when they were in labor and there were complications. And they were getting stopped and saying, you can't go to the facility, you're not allowed to travel. And so there was a cool advocacy campaign done to be able to change that. but the people that were targeted, it wasn't like just a member of the government. It was police officers and boda drivers to say, like, you have to open this up and here's why. Like, that's advocacy. It's not a law. That's like an advocacy tool to like address a concrete restriction. Fourth is understanding the messages that resonate, which is exactly the question you asked, and I've jumped around. But what I have seen during COVID and during a lot of other crises is that unfortunately the message of a rights-based approach just often doesn't work. So saying like, it's a woman's right to have access to contraception. We all know this, like that's not up for debate among this group, but it's probably up for debate among a lot of policymakers. So the messages that I've seen resonate, it's the facts, it's the consequences, it's what's actually happening, and getting those hard-hitting messages versus thinking about like my right. It's sad, but it's just the reality, and it's what we've seen across contexts. And then the very last, I promise, this is a lesson, especially for COVID, is document, document, document everything you are doing. Policymakers, advocates, media, everyone, donors are hungry for the data and the stories, and you have it and we don't. Like, it's just a reality. Like, if you're in your communities, you know what's happening, document it and share it, and you're a huge asset as a youth advocate for what we're looking for. So those are the kind of lessons I've seen that work across crises, but more so in COVID than other things I've worked on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for the brief description regarding the advocacy and the communications perspective. And just to add like a 30 seconds reminder is that of like we should always give emphasis for these time-sensitive things, especially like in case of access to safe abortion and rape and other these sensitive areas doesn't give time, so they always have to get prioritized despite the pandemic. And the other thing is that especially for youth-led organizations like us, like IAWG, so one of our challenges or the things that we should improve is that of the documentation process as well as the sharing. So maybe perhaps like you could drop us something, how we could document it, share it to like the donors or like organizations like that. So it would be much more better like for us if you show us how to do these things and also how to share it. And our last panelist is Miriam. She will speak in French. So as a community-based organization, what have you learned and what will you do differently?
Merci pour la question. Bon,
thank you so much for the question.
Je dois dire avant toute chose, c'est que
I would like
vraiment
to say before
le
anything
contexte
else
dans lequel on fonctionne
that the current context that we're functioning
n'est pas
in
seulement limité à la question du COVID-19.
is not
Et
only limited
c'est vraiment
to the question
extraordinaire
of
parce que je pense que en tant
COVID-19. It's really
qu'organisation,
quite extraordinary.
il y a un processus mental
As an
que
organization, there is
toute
sort of a
l'équipe
mental process for the
a dû
team
faire
that
pour se
the
dire que
team
bon,
had
écoutez,
to
c'est fait que nous avons le
understand
COVID maintenant, mais il ne
the
s'agit pas du
reality that
COVID seulement.
we are
Si on prend le
operating
contexte
during
dans
this
lequel on évolue,
context of COVID.
au moins depuis 2 ans et demi, c'est un pays qui
We've
a
also, for the
des
last 2
conflits
years,
récurrents et une instabilité politique. Donc, quand le COVID est arrivé, c'était une
Haiti,
situation effectivement sanitaire, une situation
crisis mode.
mais on se retrouve justement à se dire, bon, écoutez, la question pour nous, c'est pas de pouvoir tenir en attendant que les choses redeviennent comme avant, mais de se dire vraiment, de se rendre compte que il faut. I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but
I think it's because ma'am, you are on the English channel, and so those who are, so even though you're speaking in French, you're on the English channel since you're beautifully bilingual or more. So if you could change yourself to the French channel while speaking French, that would help us.
Okay. Je m'excuse.
Merci beaucoup.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Is this better now?
Super. Merci.
Yes, it's fine. Perfect. Thank you. I'm so sorry. So one of the lessons that we learned in this situation said to tell us that there's a certain mental state that we needed to realize. The question for us was not really how to manage as a team until sort of waiting out this period until COVID would go away. But we needed to realize that nothing will ever be the same, that we're confronting a whole series of situations. So we needed to have a mindset that realized that we needed to realize that we're going to have to permanently adapt a different attitude. Because at the moment where we're trying to figure out how are we going to continue to mobilize the communities in which we work in a context where, even though we don't have as many deaths as have been happening in other countries, even in our context, we need to face the impact of COVID and this situation, which continues to become more and more serious. So as an organization, this is a unique situation that we find ourselves in. But in our context, it caused us to throw a lot of what we do into question. So question our activities, question the fact that we always emphasize the importance of local work. But that's the first lesson that we learned. The second lesson we learned has to do with communication. As a community-based organization with few resources, difficulty mobilizing financing with our various funders, it really has not been easy. Difficult with each team member has at least 2 major projects or 2 in this context that we're working in terms of the funders. This has not necessarily been a priority area for them. We had to realize there's a change that we had to make. So that communication is not just a tool for communicating and for sharing the work that we do, but actually we needed to engage our funders more and adapt our technology and tools to reinforce and strengthen our programming work. And I've heard this term partnerships often today. As a community-based organization, we have an important priority of dialogue and communication. In this context, on a national level of organization, we've needed to develop and strengthen our ties and to promote inclusion and make sure that the beneficiaries of our services are able to receive them during this time. So we've had to balance the practices that we currently have and strengthen them in terms of integrating technology into the work that we do. And we also rely on local resources to get our work done. But the basic competencies of these resources have needed to be strengthened, like technology, for an example. Let me give you an example. We have an organization which is very close to young women. We need to give them extra support. But in reality, but the resources that they need in order to be relevant and do their work, that in addition to the barriers that language represents. But when we consider the tools that are most readily available, there are issues of language, and these are the major challenges that we've had to confront and deal with. But another important aspect, I did mention the context that we're functioning in has been complicated by the political situation here, which is intimately related to a lot of violence on various levels because of the impact of COVID and the impact of political instability that we currently are suffering. We have an obligation to strengthen our partnerships that we have with different organizations, so that in the context we're functioning in currently, our priorities have changed. So even though our goals and objectives haven't changed, we needed to revisit the relationships we have with our partners to adapt their capabilities to the current situation. And another aspect is we've actually needed to create new partnerships. Why? Because we've emphasized the situation of adolescents and young women, but these are organizations who do not have the necessary resources to do the work they want to do. So we've needed to look at the impact of COVID on basic means of existence for young women, and especially families. We're in a situation where we found we needed to develop new partnerships to confront the realities of working in a time of COVID, to strengthen the relationship we already have with young women. And as far as our own team, we have an approach which is focused very strongly on teamwork and the work among the team, the members of the team. But we realized that we needed to integrate the team, the resources of our team, the human resources of our team. We needed to involve them more in decision-making processes. That's what we realized, that in this stage of sort of adaptation that we're going through, we needed to create an environment that allows the team to face the emotional burden of this time we're going through. So we had to ask ourselves, how are we going to manage, in terms of organizational structure, we used to put the emphasis on program, but now we've had to sort of look again at our different organizational structures, because the main resources we had as an organization, we lost some of those resources. So we have had to redirect our attention toward new resources. So from the point of view of the beneficiaries, the participants, we've needed to involve them all in adapting to the current impact of COVID. So we've had to adapt the same strategy as a team to make sure that at each stage of adaptation, we need to make sure that each team member is part of the decision-making process in terms of organizational structure, in terms of the resources that we have at our disposal, for and to value the suggestions made by different team members. This would be my response to the question of these are some of the challenges or the ways in which we've dealt with confronting challenges of the current period.
Thank you very much, Miriam, about the brief description from the community-based organization view, especially focusing on adolescent girls. And there's not that much point that I want to add, but just wanted to emphasize on two phrases, which is like involving communities, because like those are like the ones who are facing these major challenges, and as well as to have effective communication, to engage like different societies, communities, as well as donors. And during this COVID-19 pandemics, there should be like youth-led organizations or community-based organizations should be also included in the mitigation team or task force team, so that these other essential healthcare services, as well as other essential things will be included. For example, those can be like health related, right related, and others. So they have to be also one of the components for this committee. So I will now directly take you about the challenges that has been with fundraising, and how sometimes donors have not been as flexible as needed during the COVID-19 pandemics, and how should smaller organizations like, for instance, our International Youth Alliance on Family Planning Ethiopia, fundraise for the future. But first, how do they fundraise right now? And I have a very good surprise for you. And Kate will talk later about the funding opportunity with IAWG, so stay tuned for that at the end of the session. But first, let's hear from Valentina. So Valentina, how do smaller organizations fundraise for the things they need right now?
I mean, I think some of the realities that Miriam has mentioned earlier is something that we're all facing. I mean, if you're just to look at the Global Humanitarian Response Plan funding, 3 months in, only 1% of the funding was going towards NGOs. So the landscape of institutional funding is not great. So I think, especially for smaller organizations, now we're at 18% for NGOs, but only 2% go to national and local organizations. So it's a very competitive environment at the moment, and the scarcity environment that it's only going to get worse, I'm afraid. So one thing that I would emphasize is you really need to be at the table, like what Miriam had mentioned, being in the right coordination forums, making sure that you're part of partnerships with others. Find your clusters in your country or your coordination forums for help. Be present and contribute. Be very specific about what your added value is and what is the knowledge and expertise you're bringing, because it is in the clusters where the country-based pooled funds, which are smaller pots of money, are allocated through the UN agencies to local organizations. Make sure you're not missing out on those. The clusters are also, or the coordination forums are also where donors and new opportunities are made available. And it's also a place where you can access free supplies. So UNFPA usually in a response would have free kits, but you can only access them if you're part of the cluster. So make sure you're part of this and find others that you can form consortia with. It's maybe others know of opportunities you don't know of, but if people don't know you, you're not going to be included in those bids. So just be sure to be at the table and contribute in these spaces. The other thing is, I would definitely encourage all the small organizations to lobby and network with international organizations. Many INGOs, including CARE, that have localization commitments, are now a signatory to the Charter for Change, which is a list of organizations that have committed to equitable partnerships, ensuring that not only do we work with partners, but that your operational costs are included into proposals, that the way we design the programs is very inclusive of our partnerships. I've asked the panel to actually include the link to the Charter for Change, look at the organizations and see if they're present in your country, and make sure you go and be in their face, tell them about what you do, and make sure that, you know, they know and can partner with you on key strategic priorities that are important to you as well. And just become a preferred partner. I can't stress enough how important it is that you're there ahead of a crisis. In the Philippines, we have a humanitarian partnership platform with 32 national and local organizations, and we do invest in their preparedness capacity, and they are our preferred partner during a response. So just make sure that you're known. And the last thing is, I would say really try to maximize on the public, corporate, and foundation funding that's available in your country. And don't underestimate the power of a movement. You're youth focused, your youth lead your organizations and you're serving the youth. Bring them along. Make sure that they manage your social media. Make sure that you're creating a contagious movement. One of the really interesting examples that we have from some of our countries, you might not get huge amounts of money, but maybe you'll get someone that says, I'm going to do all your transport. We've had that cases in some of the countries that we work in. We also have partnerships where banks have come and said, we really like your cash programming that you're doing with this small group that's maybe excluded from social protection mechanisms. Make sure that they know what you're doing and really maximize on technology to get people along. So I'll say, you know, just be at the table, be known, and make sure you tell your story and bring others along.
Thanks, Valentina, about the brief description regarding how these small organizations fundraise right now. And now I will directly go to Mary. And how do organizations fundraise for their activities that are possible in a COVID-19 environment, or do they plan for things post-COVID now?
Thanks, Nick. It was breaking up a little bit, so I'll just restate the question for all of the attendees. So we're thinking towards the future in fundraising. Are we planning for activities that we know are possible within a COVID scenario? Or are you thinking ahead to what could the future hold and how could programming and should programming adapt as the COVID situation adapts? And again, we know there's not a straightforward answer. We know that the only certainty we have is change. And we have no idea how this crisis is going to continue to unfold. So the answer really is that we need to do both at the same time. And there are a couple of different ways that I would approach that. I think I would say, though, kind of as a pretext, is that we've found, and I'm sure you all share this as well, that donors have been really flexible and understanding in these times. And we've had funders that have let us reallocate and repurpose funding for programs and projects that are actually relevant right now and that you can actually roll out. So I think keeping that top of mind, everybody this is such an unprecedented situation. Never before has everyone in the world been experiencing some level of the same impact from such a crisis. So keeping that top of mind, I think, is important. So going back to thinking towards the future, another tool that I would recommend, just to make this really kind of relevant and concrete for you all, it's a very simple open source tool from Bridgespan, and it is scenario planning for nonprofit organizations. I won't get into the details into the weeds of what this tool walks you through, but I would definitely recommend looking at it. But really their messaging is, we can't predict the future, so we shouldn't try. Instead, we should anchor in what matters most and develop scenario plans that allow us to make smart decisions based on various different outcomes. So they have this 4-step framework, and it looks at what are the most critical drivers to impact across 3 main areas: your impact in programming, your operations and costs, and your finances and revenue, and really focusing on those elements that are going to push the needle, that are actually going to have implications on your impact. And then you model out different scenarios for what could happen with those key drivers, the different directions they could take for the better or for the worse, and then creating action plans for each scenario. And then the final step is, what's the tipping point? What is the kind of determinant or trigger point where you should make a decision based on those scenarios? It sounds super complex, but the way they've broken it down into this tool is very agile, very light touch and iterative, streamlined. So it'll allow you, kind of looping it back to fundraising, if you have a scenario planning plan that you've created, then you have a stronger kind of evidence to go to funders and say, look, we know that these are uncertain times, and these are different scenarios that could play out. These are how they could impact our operations and our programming. And so if it's more of a communication and a rapport with a funder, then you're able to actually present this scenario plan and show them how much thought and intention you put into thinking about the different avenues. If it's a call for application, you can then look at, what are the guidelines for a call for application, and which of your scenarios could potentially relate to what this call for application is looking for. So just giving you kind of a basis of a foundation of information and evidence about the different ways that COVID could impact your different pathways will help you have more information and kind of more confidence going into proposals. And then another example I would give, which could be relevant as well, it's actually, I'm on the board of a small community-based education organization in Costa Rica called Abrir No Mentes. And what they have done, kind of linking back to Valentina's answer and question as well, is they've kind of they've divided up their resource mobilization strategies, and they've set kind of distinct intentions for the different ways that they're mobilizing resources. So for their individual giving campaigns, they've said, we're going to focus our individual giving right now on raising unrestricted funding for our current needs. And we've had to adapt our programming, and previously we were offering education services. Now we're responding to the needs of the community, and that's food security. So we're going to raise money from individual donors through light touch online campaigns, and we're going to channel all of that to food security. So we have a very clear intention, our framing is well articulated, and then we're going to kind of compartmentalize and put on the other side our efforts into proposal writing focused on the future and what we see for 3 to 6 months into the future. So it's just allowing them to not feel overwhelmed, to not say, oh my gosh, we have to raise money for now and for the future, and we don't know what the future holds. They're able to be really strategic about kind of compartmentalizing these two different strategies within their resource mobilization.
Thanks, Mir, with a brief explanation about regarding our fundraising for the future. And now I will go to Miriam. And what's your organization doing for fundraising in Haiti for the next several months to 1 year?
Just a moment, please. Switching channel.
Just a minute.
Bon, ce que je dois dire, c'est que depuis dans le début de l'année, effectivement, sur la base de ce que nous avions constaté par rapport à cette situation.
I think you're still on the French. Yes. I mean, I think you're still on the English channel.
Sorry. Oh.
No problem.
Okay. I think this is fine now. Okay, thanks. So since the beginning of this year, it's true, we had to focus on several aspects. The first aspect we had to focus on was partnerships. I think Valentina mentioned this, the importance of seeing how to work with organizations who are already working in Haiti, because we don't really have enough resources to intervene or to work on every level. So we had to sort of establish a consortium to mobilize resources, because we realized that the philanthropic environment evolved with this COVID situation. So we needed actually to offer more possibilities because of the amount of competition. So we had to figure out what to put the priority on at the moment. So the strategy that we implemented was to establish partnerships with organizations that have the same vision as we, the same capabilities as we, and how we could join resources together, combine our resources in order to be more effective. I would also say that in terms of immediate support, when we talk about resource mobilization, especially in Haiti, we think about money and funds. But in this current context, I've realized that there's a special effort that needs to be made to put the value, like monetary value, on other services that are carried out by different partner organizations and partner and community-based organizations, to see how we could develop a tool that would allow us not only to mobilize resources, but also to account for them and quantify the resources. So across time, how we could mobilize these resources. And we also had to deal with the constraints that exist in terms of financing and in terms of addressing certain needs like psychological needs and communication needs, how to approach these challenges using the platforms that exist and focus on specific elements of our implementation. But since the beginning of the year, we put in place an internship program, which has allowed us to work at the local level and to, so in a situation of lack of financial resources, it's allowed us to create and to broaden our space for youth who are motivated and who have capabilities to strengthen at certain levels of our needs, keeping in mind our different limitations and financial resources. That's been really useful. The last point I would like to mention, for the last few years, we've been looking at how to involve the private sector in our activities. Not just in terms of financing, but in different aspects of our networks and activities. So for the last few months, the environment in which the private sector is working right now is not really favorable to partnerships, because things are so unclear in this current era of COVID. So we're trying to find out, just to see how we can involve or apply a recruitment strategy for members, which would allow us to obtain non-restricted financial resources. So in that sense, what we're doing and will continue to do is we are strengthening networking between platforms of youth platforms that represent an excellent source of motivation, local strength, with networks of young Haitians who live abroad. So the youth platform that exists in Haiti, it's been very, we have tried to locate or put in touch these segments of young Haitians who are capable of helping with financing. It's been useful to put these two networks together. And we're constantly needing to adapt to the situation in Haiti, which is challenging.
Okay, thank you very much, Miriam, about explaining how these community-based organizations doing for fundraising, and it's really good that you are in contact with different organizations outside of Haiti in order to support and fund youth-led organizations. So I'm going to let you know or explain briefly about the fundraising or grant tip sheet, or the videos that we are going to share on the chat box. Regarding that, the FP2020 have a wonderful step-by-step guideline or video, as well as a work tip sheet about how to write a successful grant letter, as well as fundraising, as well as right after we receive this grant letter, what are like the useful steps that we are going to do. So you can briefly get these documents in our chat box, as well as the video, which is on YouTube, which you can easily stream it, as well as share it within your youth-led networks in your country, in your community, as well as community-based organizations. Next, as we hear from Alicia on advocating for sexual reproductive health and rights during COVID-19, communications are essential or a critical piece for securing fundraising and showing your organization's impact. And what communication platforms should we be utilizing? For instance, how can we use e-platforms to show positive effects on our COVID-19 response programming?
Great, thank you. So I think Valentina said it in her response earlier about needing people to know who you are, that having a bigger profile among donors and showing your value add and your assets really helps with fundraising. And if we're ever going to find a silver lining with COVID, I think it's that because everyone is online out of necessity, donors and decision makers are more accessible to everyone than ever before. It's obviously more complicated than that, but because people are online, you can get creative about how you can engage in a way that maybe was far more difficult before this happened. And so using communications, it can be used for building your profile through all of these different platforms, which, as Valentina said, it makes you more aware, it makes your profile bigger. When donors are searching you, it makes you a go-to resource in their mind because they've read what you've written on a blog, or they're following you as a thought leader in your community. And so now, like, you know, what does Katie have to say? And I need to look and ask her and invest in her. And so there's lots of different platforms. Just a few examples. And again, back to, I think, what Meredith said at the beginning, we're not reinventing the wheel here. It's not about like creating new e-platforms to reach donors or to reach decision makers. It's about getting creative with what already exists. So this isn't necessarily an e-platform, but traditional media is such a good tool, because if donors see your organization's name as a quoted resource, they're going to have you top of mind as a really legitimate group to invest in. If you don't know journalists, I've literally DM'd a journalist on Twitter in order to get in touch. So like, I didn't have their contact. I wanted to tell a story to them. I found them on Twitter and I sent them a message, and they wrote back because they were interested. So you can reach them in different ways. Social media, I mean, obviously you're already on these platforms, so you can go and find donors. So find out what a donor is talking about on their Facebook account or on their Twitter account, and send them messages. If they're talking about something, respond with your perspective and just have that dialogue that keeps you top of mind. Phone and SMS and WhatsApp. This is certainly relevant for donors, but it's also just more broadly for the advocacy side, and shows that you can be creative and resourceful in how you're sharing stories. One cool example, this isn't really donor related, but I just think it's cool, is there was an IPPF youth peer educators group in the DRC, I believe, and they had used WhatsApp to help collect information from other adolescents on how they were experiencing COVID, and also to share information not only on COVID, but SRH. And then the recorded answers of what they got, these youth peer educators then went on and like met with ministry officials and advocated for adolescent services. So I was reading about that, and I thought it was interesting, less so for the donor side, but more so because it shows how you can creatively like capture stories through WhatsApp, and then use the stories you're capturing to tell that and amplify it to other people. So if you use WhatsApp in your community, you could go to a donor and say, I know my community doesn't have access to contraception. We need you to invest in access to these services, and it's just a different way. And the very last two platforms, I'll point out, they're really specific. One is called Voices for Youth. It was started by UNICEF, and it basically invites young people to share their experiences during COVID response. You can do it through blogs, you can do it through illustrations, poems, really a bunch of different artistic expressions of what you are experiencing in the response. And donors can search it, they can see what you're talking about, and it just gives you that profile that you need and that we all need. And aligned with that is this thing called U Report that's really connected to the same platform, and you can become a U reporter, where you are bringing your experiences from your communities and sharing it out through these networks. So just again, another way that you are the expert in sharing your stories. The only final thing I'll add there is, I think that Miriam said this, is that not everyone has access to these tools, whether it's an issue of airtime, an issue of language, or connectivity. I think we all have a responsibility from the global or the NGO side, but also you from youth-led organizations, to try to get creative and be inclusive. So like, if you have funds, ask your donor if you can allocate some airtime for a community-based organization to get engaged as well, because the more perspectives, the better in this response. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alicia. And now I will turn it over to questions from the audience.
So far, only one person has indicated that they have a question and think they're gonna put it in the chat box. So for now, maybe, I don't know, Katie, do you want to give the fundraising update, since you only have a couple minutes left? And if Henry's gets his question in, we can add it in. But in the meanwhile, have Katie give her the funding opportunity update.
That sounds great. So I think that Samantha's going to share this so that you can see in English and French. what this fundraising opportunity is. So in connection with this webinar series, we wanted to provide advice and some small funding to help you with your operational needs. So IAWG is providing $2,500 to $3,000 one-time grants to support you all. This is just for youth-led and community-based organizations serving young people. And these operational needs include things like laptops, printers, internet cards, things that you need to keep your ship running. This isn't for programming or for specific activities, it's just for strict operations. So we'll be accepting applications until September 23rd, and I'm going to put the link for the application and for additional information in the chat box. But feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email address as well if you have any questions, and we look forward to seeing your application.
C'est Katie. Oui, oui. Ça va? Tu tiens encore?
Okay. So do we have any questions from the audience? Especially if you are like a youth-led organization, it's a very important time for you to ask these wonderful panelists so that they could give you all the brief description about fundraising and getting grants. So it's really good, like if you use your opportunity here.
Nick, since we're at time, maybe we should just encourage everyone to send their questions to the email that Katie just provided in the chat box. So if you're interested in that fund, or if you have other questions that haven't been answered, encourage everyone to send an email to Katie and we'll follow up with our panelists.
Okay, so perhaps like while going through the files that we have shared, the links, or like the video, which we are going to share later on, if you have any questions, feel free like to send through the email that Kate just shared, and we will try our best to answer your questions as prompt as possible. So I would like to thank all our speakers and for everyone who have joined our series. And I just want to remind you one more time that this session was recorded and will be shared along with any other materials and notes discussed in a follow-up communications. And one other thing is that please share it along with your network using different social media platforms so that maybe some of the people may not know about this, but might use these important tools. So now I will turn back to Kate.
No, just thank you all for joining for 1, 2, or all 3 sessions, and we look forward to staying engaged with you and seeing your applications through the funding opportunity. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day or night or morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Bye.